On today's Exploring History podcast, we'll discuss how Christianity changed the world.
Welcome to Exploring History with Ray Knotgrass, a production of Knotgrass History.
When Augustus Caesar died in 14 AD, there were a total of 0 Christians in the world. It was a pagan world, with pagan temples pretty much in every village, town, and city in the world. Pagan temples hosted public functions. The Grand Temple of Artemis in Ephesus, for instance, was not a fringe storefront that a few strange people attended, but it was a main part of civic life and a center of worship. Among other functions, the Temple of Artemis served as something like a bank because of the wealth it had from donations and because wealthy people deposited their money there for safekeeping. When slaves had saved up enough money to buy their freedom, they went to the Temple of Artemis to do it. The thought world was pagan. Most people assumed the existence of many gods, and those gods had definite character. Humans were understood to be pawns of the deities, perhaps a byproduct or afterthought of the deities' activities. Immorality was not only tolerated, but some belief systems encouraged it. Judaism, which had the law God had given them, existed, and the Jews knew all that God had done for Israel for centuries. But certain groups within Judaism practiced a faith that was steeped in tradition. Judaism was divided, and the practice of it was a burden to many. The world of Augustus Caesar was also a hard world. Average life expectancy was relatively short because of high infant mortality rates, constant wars, and limited medical care. A tiny minority of people lived in comfort and luxury. By far, most people struggled to get by and eke out their daily bread. Hardly anyone had any say in who would govern them. A handful at the top of the social structure decided matters of government. Here we are 2,000 years later, and that's not the world we live in today. Today, in most countries, there are church buildings dotting the landscape. Many countries around the world have a considerable Christian presence. We have amazing health care available for hundreds of millions of people. We benefit from sanitation, technology, and the rapid transportation of people and goods. Slavery still exists, but it is the exception, not the rule. People around the world have the right to vote and to participate in elections and government far beyond what used to be the case. What made the difference? Why is our world so different from the world that once existed? The biggest reason why the world is so different from the way it used to be has been the spread of Christianity. The Christian faith has been the single biggest factor for positive change in the history of the world. Christians haven't done everything right, and sometimes what they have done has been destructive. But overall, human society is different and better than it was 2,000 years ago, even 200 years ago, because of Christians following the teachings and example of Jesus. Let's trace this story. Less than 20 years after Augustus died, something happened in a corner of the Roman Empire called Judea. A teacher arose among the Jews who did some amazing things and said some amazing things. For instance, this teacher told his followers, as recorded in Matthew 5, verses 13 through 16, "You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven." This teacher also said, as recorded in John 13, verse 35, By this everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another. What other world religion has this as its identifying mark? Was this the identifying mark of the French Revolution or communism? No. Christianity is not just about transformed beliefs, but about transformed lives as well. This teacher also said, as recorded in John 15 and verse 8, "This is to my Father's glory, that you bear much fruit, showing yourselves to be my disciples." How is God to be glorified? How are followers of Jesus to show that they are, in fact, disciples of Jesus? Is it by the distinctive buildings or statues they construct? By prayer and meditation practices? By holding certain political positions? No. It's by showing through their lives that God has made a difference in them and by serving the people around them. In the judgment scene described in Matthew 25, when the Lord separates the sheep from the goats, what is the standard, the test? It is whether they gave food to the hungry, water to the thirsty, provided hospitality and clothing, cared for the sick, and visited the prisoner. In other words, the test is whether their lives showed that Jesus was their Lord. At the end of his ministry, this teacher, Jesus, was crucified and then was raised from the dead. And then he gave his disciples the Great Commission to go and tell the good news of forgiveness, hope, and new life. We who are part of this movement know that it was for good, but in the day it began, the leaders of Israel saw it as a threat because it challenged their system. Roman leaders also saw it as a threat because it wasn't the state religion, and it therefore challenged the belief in Caesar as Lord, and so they thought it was treasonous and needed to be stamped out. When Jesus' followers were first called Christians, that term was not intended to be a compliment. When Jewish leaders accused the church in Acts of turning the world upside down, they didn't mean that as a compliment either. The accusers meant they are upsetting everything. Great persecutions arose against what was called the Way. Acts tells of abuse heaped upon Christians in many cities around the empire. Later in the 1st century, Emperor Nero blamed a great fire in Rome on Christians. Many Romans saw Christians as pests. Nero wrapped Christians in animal skins, dipped them in tar, and set them ablaze to use as lights for his garden party. That atrocity is what the leaders of the greatest political and military power on earth were capable of. Roman authorities demanded that Christians recant their beliefs, and when they didn't, they threw them to the lions in the Colosseum. According to tradition, the two greatest teachers of the Way, Peter and Paul, were martyred. Persecutions continued in various places and at various levels of intensity for over 300 years within the Roman Empire. But the church Jesus established didn't wither. Instead, it grew. People heard something in the gospel that they believed was worth living for and worth dying for. And those believers didn't just barely hang on and go into hiding. They were salt and light, just as Jesus told them to be. They were leaven with good influence, and they changed the world. The official acceptance of Christianity in the Roman Empire in the 4th century A.D. helped the spread of Christianity in some ways, but it complicated things in other ways. But Christianity changed the world under the radar by the changed lives of Christians. Christians have dealt with antagonistic power structures and ungodly societal practices time after time and in place after place, and they have changed the world in spite of that. The central reality is that the gospel created a transformed people, and those people, empowered by God, began to change the world. Let's look at some specific examples of this. Christianity changed the value that society placed on children. In Greek and Roman cultures, which many today hold up as great civilizations, the practice of killing infants was commonplace. There were various reasons for it. Babies who were unwanted, deformed, or female often met this fate. If these children were not killed outright, they were often abandoned to be picked up by traffickers and sold into slavery. In some pagan cultures, children were offered as human sacrifices. Abortion was commonplace. Plato wrote that he thought it was reasonable for children to be taken from their parents and reared in group settings. Plato also thought it was reasonable to do away with disabled children. The world has been very hard on children. Christians had a different motivation, a different view of the worth of children, based on Jesus' words about welcoming children. Christians opposed abortion. They rescued infants who were abandoned. Their love, concern, and care for children changed the world. Christianity changed the value society placed on adults. As bad as our culture is, we haven't yet reached the point where thousands of people attend huge amphitheaters to watch the battle of two men to the death. We watch actors do this on TV and in movies, but it doesn't really happen. The real thing was common in the Roman Empire. Sometimes it was man against man. Sometimes a man fought against a wild animal. We are shocked that this was once the case, and the reason we are shocked is because of the transforming influence of Christianity. In the 1st century A.D., prisoners had no rights. The terrible treatment Jesus experienced while he was in custody was not unusual for prisoners. If a prisoner received any food or care, it came from friends on the outside of prison. Through history up to that point, slavery was commonplace and accepted. Because of the growing influence of Christianity, the practice of slavery began slowly to fade from society. It did exist in some areas, but not nearly so much in places where many people had become Christians. Believers saw that slavery was inconsistent with God's view of the value of people. Christianity changed the way women were valued. In Jesus' day, women had few legal rights. They usually couldn't own property. A woman had no rights about being divorced. They were rarely seen in public in cities such as Rome or Athens. Jesus treated women differently. He treated them with respect and honor as fellow humans, and the Church continued that practice. Hindus followed the practice of sati, which is a widow throwing herself on the funeral pyre of her husband, and if the widow resisted doing so, those around the funeral pyre forced her onto it. Christian influence lessened this practice in India. The Chinese practice of binding the feet of women ended because of Christian influence. Jesus was the great liberator of women who had been held in virtual slavery, who were seen as objects, as property. To be sure, Christian people have not always honored the principles of Jesus, but the way of Jesus opened the door. Life is better for women because of Christianity. Christianity changed the common view of morality and marriage. In pagan cultures, immorality was rampant. This is how they believed their deities behaved. Marriage had little value beyond procreation. The way of Jesus ushered in a profound revolution in sexual morality and the honor given to marriage and purity. In Ephesians 5, Paul says, "Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for it." We think of that as basic teaching about marriage, but in fact, it was revolutionary. Christianity changed the care provided for the sick. Christianity changed the way people thought about people. A tradition of caring for those in need developed during the early years of Christianity, when the church cared for the sick, fed the hungry, cared for widows and children, clothed the poor, and offered hospitality to strangers. These practices continued with the growth of monastic orders in the 5th and 6th centuries and extended into the Middle Ages. The Alexian brothers in Germany and the Low Countries organized care for victims of the Black Plague in the 14th century. Also at this time, cities established institutions for people with contagious diseases such as leprosy. During a plague, when others fled the towns, Christians were known to be the ones to stay and to care for the victims. The best-known international effort for providing care is the Red Cross. What is the meaning of the Red Cross if not a Christian symbol? That was its founder's purpose and the statement he wanted to make. Christianity transformed education. Schools existed in the ancient world, but the first modern universities began for theological training. Luther and Calvin urged the establishment of public schools so people could learn to read, so that they could read the Bible. Christian people began Sunday schools to teach academic subjects and give religious instruction to children who worked in English factories on the other 6 days of the week. They did this to help the children. The leaders of the Sunday school movement believed that children were not just to be a source of cheap labor, but they knew their value as beloved of God. The list of how Christianity changed the world goes on and on. Modern science developed because of the belief that God is rational, that His works can be known, that the world has a point, a meaning. At one time, the study of the physical world was undertaken to glorify God. The concept of political freedom developed because of the value Christianity placed on the individual. Economic liberty developed because of Christianity's view of the worth of work and the freedom of the marketplace. People came to realize that the economy did not have to be a top-down system where rulers called all the shots. Instead, shopkeepers could set prices. Traders could make profits. People could improve their lot in life. These were all ideas inspired by Christianity. Workers were not just to be used by businessmen, but were to be treated as humans. Medieval art, the classical music of Handel and Bach, the inspiring architecture of cathedrals were all undertaken because Christians believed that everything should be done to honor God. Consider the way words and phrases from the Bible, especially from the King James Bible, have affected the English language. Phrases such as, turn the other cheek, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, the Good Samaritan. The list goes on and on. Even the dating of our years is done because of Christianity. Despite the attempt to cover that up with the phrases common era and before common era, even with those changes, the way we record years is still based on when Christ was born. The world has had plenty of opportunities to discard Christianity, but Christianity continues and grows. Shortly after the dissolution of the USSR, I read this comment by Nadia Hundert, who had lived under communism. Today, as a consequence of an atheistic upbringing, we are knee-deep in alcoholics, drug addicts, other chemically dependent individuals, loafers, bums, criminals, savages, uncouths, dullards, cruel and frightful juveniles who commit crimes for the fun of it. These are people who were brought up by non-believer parents in an atheistic society. Christians lived with religion for 1,000 years, meaning from the coming of the faith to Eastern Europe, and provided us with a rich heritage, which we have succeeded in destroying without fire or flood. It would be a very good thing if, in restructuring the school curriculum, the education specialists included teaching of religion in our schools. After the fall of the Soviet Union, people flocked to churches and craved Bibles. Public schools in the former Soviet Union wanted Bible curriculum for their students. Though communist leaders in China wanted Christianity to wither there, in reality, it is growing there. Christians have not done everything right. We are still sinners. But overall, the long-term story has been that Christians have transformed the world because Christ gave them a transformed view of themselves, of other people, and of the world around them. In Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis said that thinking of the eternal world is, quote, one of the things a Christian is meant to do. It does not mean that we are to leave the present world as it is. If you read history, you will find that the Christians who did most for the present world were just those who thought most of the next. The apostles themselves, who set on foot the conversion of the Roman Empire, the great men who built up the Middle Ages, the English evangelicals who abolished the slave trade, all left their mark on earth precisely because their minds were occupied with heaven. It is since Christians have largely ceased to think of the other world that they have become so ineffective in this. Aim at heaven, and you will get earth thrown in. Aim at earth, and you will get neither. End quote. In the middle of the 1st century A.D., Rome was the great world power. Christianity was a small sect of Jews. Its leader had been executed as a despised criminal, and for centuries the movement was illegal. Then a few centuries later, the Roman Empire fell. But that little band of people who followed the itinerant carpenter teacher, at first one by one, then a group of 12, then a group of 120, then a few thousand, survived and kept growing. That outlaw group that was persecuted and ridiculed, whose peaceful members were put in prisons and cast before lions, whose doctrines were ridiculed and dismissed, that little group is a kingdom, an eternal kingdom, that has lasted for 2,000 years and will last into eternity. Who would have thought this possible in Jesus' day? Christianity has had a profound influence, but today we see strong secular influences, and we see some failures by Christian people. As a result, today we live in a world in which human life is cheap. Human trafficking is growing. Innocent people are blown up to make political statements. Abortion is widely accepted. Marriage and biblical morality are ridiculed. People are again abandoning babies. Paganism has reappeared, and we are told, how can we be so intolerant as to say one view is wrong and another is right? We know of persecution of Christians in some parts of the world, and even opposition to Christianity in the nation whose motto is, "In God we trust." What are Christians to do in today's world? We are to be salt, light, and leaven. We are to practice transforming love. That is the way Christians changed the 1st century world, and it's how we'll change the world today. Our situation today is an opportunity to grow, to be distinct, to offer light, hope, and truth, just as the 1st century was. I want to make an important point. Jesus came to call people to be His disciples. When people respond to that call, they change how they live and how they see the world. It's because of that change within that His disciples have been motivated to go tell others and to call them to follow Jesus. In that new life is the power and motivation to change the world around us. Jesus is still the Savior. He is still worth living for and still worth dying for. And that commitment will change the world. I'm Ray Notgrass. Thanks for exploring history and for helping change the world today.
This has been Exploring History with Ray Notgrass, a production of Notgrass History. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast in your favorite podcast app, and please leave a rating and review so that we can reach more people with our episodes. If you want to learn about new homeschool resources and opportunities from Notgrass History, you can sign up for our email newsletter at exploringhistorypodcast.com. This program was produced by me, Titus Anderson. Thanks for listening.